Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. And that means it's time to begin our week-long series previewing what might be the weirdest and or wildest MCU project yet, Loki. There are a lot of podcasts that talk Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. Instead of jumbling all our thoughts together into one big ramble, we divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 distinct shows, each with its own unique lens. Now that Loki's dropping on Wednesdays instead of Fridays, we're also changing up our order a bit. You'll get Ponder Vision every single Saturday during Loki. This is our brain bender of a show where Jesse Taylor and I sift through the episode to unearth and answer its most intriguing questions. Everything from how it affects the wider MCU to how it reflects the truths of our own reality. Then, on Mondays, we'll bring you our Character Cast, where Christine Kippens and I dissect the episode through the lenses of the characters themselves. Winners and losers, smart and terrible decisions, the storylines that move us the most, and more. And because Character Cast is on Mondays, we'll also preview what may lie ahead for those characters. And speaking of previews, we'll preview Loki by evaluating 3 distinct versions of the main man himself, past Loki, present Loki, and the Loki of the future. But as always, we begin our analysis with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down the latest episode of Marvel TV, not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. This is one of the most original TV analysis shows anywhere, and you can only get it here on the Marvelous TV Club. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always on Storycast, I'm joined by our 2 story experts from the iconic website, salon.com, writer Amanda Marcotte. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is the professor of English and the director of the Digital Arts and Humanities program at Manhattan College, Maeve Adams. Welcome, Dr. A.
Excited to be back.
So before we get into all of this, I am curious, which era of time are you most hoping to see Loki visit? I don't think it's a secret, given that we're dealing with an agency called the Time Variance Authority, given that Loki blinked out of Endgame, that we're going to get him traveling through time. So where do you want to see him end up most? Maeve, what do you think?
Well, this is probably going to come as no surprise to anybody who knows that my era of specialty is the 19th century, primarily in Britain. But I also think that Loki would be a fun character to see in 19th century Britain for a whole host of reasons. And very specifically, I think late 19th century Britain, where I think he would get on swimmingly with a kind of trickster figure, namely Oscar Wilde.
Oh, that's cool.
They would definitely have good, hang out, do dinner together, trade witticisms.
Exactly. And mess around with one another.
Wow.
Probably.
Yeah.
It's still an open question where Loki is on the spectrum, so
I know, he's an amorphous figure in all kinds of ways. And I think it would be fun, not to mention, it's like the beginning of the heyday of suffrage, so many amazing social and cultural changes happening, the beginning of the end of empire. This is a great time for a trickster figure to show up and really, throw some more wrenches in the works.
What about you, Amanda? Where do you want to see Loki show up in history?
Similarly, it'd probably be no surprise to anyone who knows me that I would love to see him crop up in the 70s punk scene.
Oh,
yes.
Nice. Yeah.
He can go to England and fuck with the Brits, or he can be in America, the much cooler scene here in New York. Play at CBGB's. He'd be a great punk rocker either way, right?
Hang out with the Ramones. He kind of looks like a Ramone.
Yeah, he could definitely look like a Ramone. Just stop combing your hair and wear rattier clothes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think that'd be cool. I like the idea of Rome. I just think it'd be cool to see him fucking around with senators and all that shit. Some togas would be a good look for him, I feel like. So I'm hoping for a little Roman history to pop up, but who knows? They've really kept all of that stuff under wraps. Other than that picture of him as D.B. Cooper, I don't think we know for sure exactly when and where he's going to pop up. But let's get into today's preview. Storycast is all about analyzing Marvel TV as a part of the wider world of literature and film, and Loki is in many ways one of Marvel's most literary characters. This is not only because he's based in Norse mythology. Loki represents a really iconic kind of character, the Trickster. So that's what we're going to discuss today. What makes someone a trickster, especially when talking about myths and gods? What are some of the most famous tricksters and trickster gods from other works? And what might their stories tell us about where Loki's is headed in what could be his final chapter in the MCU? So I thought we would begin with a very simple question. What would you say are the defining qualities of a trickster god? Amanda, where would you begin with an essential quality for a trickster god?
I mean, on the D&D scale, they're always chaotic.
Okay.
Yep.
Probably chaotic neutral most of the time, right?
Meaning what? Like, how does that manifest, right? Like, so they're chaotic neutral. Does that mean what? That they are just difficult people to get along with? Like, how does that work?
Oh, as someone playing a chaotic neutral in our current campaign, I don't think my character is difficult to get along with at all.
Your character is actually a blast. She is always threatening to kidnap people.
Yes, exactly. So that's a very good example. Somebody who upends the social order, doesn't care about social norms, and in fact, actively seeks out flipping over tables, challenging boundaries, challenging social order. Punk rock.
Punk rock.
Yeah, a real threat to or a disruptor of the kind of conventional hierarchies of whatever society they occupy, really sort of pressing against the norms of power and privilege. A character for our own times, a character for every time, but really a character for our own times.
Does that mean this character shows up in stories that are set in heavily ordered societies, or they tend to show up in like the 70s punk scene, to Amanda's point, where they're already in the midst of chaos?
Tricksters appear throughout the history of literature. They start showing up in much more dramatic ways in feudal societies, particularly in the context of occasions which allow those who don't have power and privilege, right, like people like peasants, right, to take on, even just for a day, right, like kind of Halloween style, carnival style, take on the role of those who have power. And there are lots of examples of this in medieval literature, in Renaissance literature. But what I think is interesting is that we don't stop seeing tricksters. So even in societies like 1960s, 1970s America or Britain, the trickster figure doesn't disappear.
Yeah, I mean, you see this kind of mentality even in like Arthurian legends and Chaucer, things like that.
Yeah. And, I think there's something really joyously countercultural about the trickster figure. And so they belong in any society where norms have become ossified in particular kinds of contexts, right? Whether that's something with respect to sexual norms or gender norms or class norms. And so, yes, we see them in highly ordered and organized societies, but we also see them in any context where norms have become ossified in a particular kind of way. And there's some figure who's going to be a renegade, seeking change with respect to those hierarchies.
And in fact, I would challenge the idea that punk is like a punk era is somehow different than the kind of context we'd see a trickster in, because if you think about it, the rise of punk rock, as I said, is the most trickster of musical genres. Is a reaction to the calcified, ossified social norms of the 1950s and 1960s in the US and Britain. It grows out of the counterculture. It is a reaction both to kind of the man in the gray flannel suit type 50s like rigidity, but it's also a reaction to like hippies and their kind of leftist countercultural rigidity. That's what tricksterism is always about, not being rigid.
You're much more an expert on music than I am, but arguably grunge is another kind of variation of that upending of sort of particular musical conventions that are also attached to social conventions, at least according to the artists of those that produce those forms.
Yeah, and it always invokes the feeling that you really want to get when you have a trickster character in literature, mythology, whatever, which is or that trickster energy in a celebration, which is the thrill of transgression, the joy of flipping over tables.
Yeah.
So Maeve, what would you say are some other qualities of a trickster or trickster god?
Well, tricksters are typically marginalized figures who don't respect the kind of pieties of their societies. They're, despite being figures that are marginalized in one way or another, they are also crafty. They are super intelligent because they know how to push the buttons of those in power.
One of the things that's really important to understand about them is that as much as they are in tension with the society that they're kind of satirizing, commenting on, disrupting, in mythology, tricksters often function as creative agents. Mm-hmm. A lot of creation, destruction, mythologies, the sort of stories that cultures tell about how they became to be involve a trickster disrupting something so that something new could come from it. So they are creative agents.
And agents of progress in that sense. And then, and it change that is meant to generate new forms of more inclusive, accepting societies.
Yeah, because they're not stuck in the old ways of thinking. They can create innovative ways of being and help a culture move itself along. So you see that come up a lot in trickster stories. They're inventors often.
You guys are kind of making me feel like these are very positive and happy and noble beings, but I do feel like Loki has been wielded more or less as a villain throughout this story. Are these qualities always manifesting positively that you're describing, or are they ever used in a sort of antagonistic way?
I mean, the Loki of mythology is a bad guy in a lot of ways. I mean, he gives birth to demonic creatures, or he fathers demonic creatures. That
sounds like a bad kind of change to be an agent of.
Yeah. He brings the end of the world.
Sure.
In Norse mythology. He does a lot of terrible things. It's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking of a trickster as being a positive figure because the transgressive energy is so gleeful and fun for people.
Yeah.
But the whole point of the trickster type character is to really recognize that all of these things kind of have two sides to the coin. Order can cause, conservatism, it can cause stifling, it can cause oppression, right? But order is also how societies function.
Yeah.
So chaos can cause creativity, chaos can cause social change, but chaos can also, be a riot, and it can be bad.
Especially when chaos is for chaos's sake.
And they're not moral characters.
No, because they disobey the morals of their world in order to alter what those morals allow for in their world. So, somebody like Charles Dickens's Madame Defarge in Tale of Two Cities is a chaos agent. She's a revolutionary. She's a problem because her chaos, the chaos that she seeks, which is the very thing that will allow for a transformation of French society into a more democratic republic, is so rooted in chaos and violence that, at least according to Dickens, right, she's not good. Whether she's evil is a question, right? And I think that that's something that, Loki as a character in the various representations of Loki mythologically and also in the films, right, is a figure who toes a line between good and evil. And it's hard for us to pin him down in any kind of meaningful way. What we can say is he's chaotic.
Yeah, and I would say that trickster gods specifically are largely a part of pagan mythologies, right? So they kind of stem from a time when those kind of monotheistic notions of good and evil aren't they're just not considered the same, right? There's a lot of the god figures are not there to be moral instruction on goodness and evil. They are there to embody certain eternal truths of humanity and the world that we live in. And one of those eternal truths is that chaos is neither good nor evil. It just is.
Right.
Well, yeah. And the gods of classical antiquity are gods, the stories about which explain the chaos of the universe, but don't make it right? Christian, Judeo-Christian mythologies offer up God as an ordering agent in the world, as a way to sort of help us understand that, in fact, there is a noble end to all of this, or a good end. The good and evil is fundamentally distinctive in the ways that you're saying, Amanda, between a classical world and what we think of as modernity. And I think it's interesting that, because gods also in classical antiquity are themselves trickstery. Classical religion doesn't separate tricksters and non-tricksters, right? The God of Christianity is not a trickster. He's not playing tricks. He has a plan, right? Whereas Zeus is always running around like messing with people's lives, right? As a kind of trickster, not for the same reasons, right? He's not a boundary violator, right? It doesn't upend the rules of society, right? But he is a chaos agent. So there's a kind of homology between the gods of classical antiquity and the tricksters that kind of overturn the sort of the norms of society.
Yeah, you definitely cannot map on to modern Islam, Christianity, those kinds of religions, and the way that, like say ancient Greeks or ancient Norse thought of these things, because, in Christianity, the kind of equivalent of Zeus or of God and Satan is Zeus and Hades.
Yeah.
But neither of them is good or Zeus or Hades is not good or evil. They just are.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So tricksters are chaotic on the D&D scale. They are disruptors of conventional hierarchies. They are countercultural. They stand against piety. They can push against a bunch of rigid norms in society that frustrate us, but they're not moral characters because they tend to stand against order. And while they might not usually be evil per se, they're not necessarily good either, because order obviously brings us a lot of things like safety and security and stability, all these things that, matter for people to have like normal and safe lives, particularly if you're not an immortal god being. So you mentioned Madame Defarge, Maeve. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the most famous or familiar trickster gods in literature or stories. Amanda, do you have one that jumps to mind?
Well, I kind of started by thinking about who the trickster gods are, because that's where the concept really comes from mythology. And obviously, probably the most famous, besides Loki, is Hermes in the Greek pantheon. He's the messenger god, but he is also a thief. And some of the best stories about Hermes in Greek mythology are him getting one over on motherfuckers, especially Apollo. Because Apollo is, of all the Greek gods, the one who is the most orderly and rigid, and he represents civilizations and
takes that same trip through the sky every single day.
Very predictable.
Yeah, he's that guy. And Hermes likes to fuck with him. Like, one of the most famous stories of Hermes is when he steals Apollo's cattle pretty much for the hell of it. And the story is fun because the point of the story is all the clever ways that Hermes hides his theft from Apollo by tying brooms to the cows' feet so that they sweep up their own hoof tracks after them while he herds them away. And Hermes helps Zeus cheat on Hera all the time, so he's a trickster against monogamy and that particular expectation. So that's the one that first came to mind for me.
So I have a serious question about that. Do you actually think Loki is more famous than Hermes now? That would be quite a feat for the Marvel Universe. Do you think that's true?
Yes.
I do too, kind of. That's wild to think about. 20 years ago, I don't think it would have been a contest, right? Hermes would have been more famous. Or do I have that wrong, don't you think?
No. No one would have any idea who Loki was, right? Hermes is, is one of the figures that, we regularly tell stories about and have told stories about over and over again. Hermes is not that different from a whole bunch of other characters that, are kind of borrowing from the Hermes narrative.
Sure.
But it's funny because it's Loki is famous as a Marvel character, but I think most people would be shocked to know, for instance, that he's most famous in Norse mythology for bringing the end of the world.
Yeah, they do kind of elide that in the actual Ragnarok movie, right? He actually does his bit to help stave it off. Although he does bring it about technically. That's what Thor sends him to do, is to bring up, what's his name, with the flaming head and the sword. I can't believe I'm blanking on giant demon guy's, name, but, Thor sends Loki to go do that. So I guess in that sense, he does bring Ragnarok, but it's for justice, I guess. I don't know. Hermes is a great call. Maeve, who jumps to mind for you besides, of course, Madame Defarge, you already mentioned?
Yeah, well, speaking of, thieves, right? Dickens is the Artful Dodger is a very clear trickster character who also, he also steals for simply the sake of stealing, but also for undoing the class distinctions that mean that the Artful Dodger will never sort of have a foothold in the world in the way that the wealthier people around him do.
So I am totally blanking on which work that would be in. Talk to me about the Artful Dodger a little bit.
Yeah, so the Artful Dodger is introduced in Oliver Twist. And so Oliver Twist is a story about an orphan, most of us know. The orphan who asks, "Can I have some more, please?" from the workhouse manager who's handing out gruel to the children in the workhouse who, work while they are young, little babies. And so finally, Oliver gets gets out of the workhouse and he gets taken up by these basically grave robbers. And the Artful Dodger works with the grave robbers and is an exceptionally talented thief and tries to kind of be a kind of mentor to Oliver. And according to the narrative, thankfully Oliver is saved by the good older men who sort of adopt Oliver and take care of his religious education.
Maeve, what about Shakespeare, though? Like, there've got to be some tricksters in Shakespearean literature.
Shakespeare loves a trickster. I mean, the one that I love the most of all of his tricksters, and in some ways it's kind of strange to think of him as a trickster because he's more of a wingman than a trickster, but that's Falstaff in Henry IV. Henry IV is primarily a story not just of Henry's rise to the throne, but of Hal, Prince Hal's relationship. Hal becomes Henry. Prince Hal's relationship with Falstaff, who is a bar owner and loves playing tricks on customers and on his wife. And there are some really funny, wonderful moments between Hal and Falstaff where they carry out, pranks together. But one of the ways in which Falstaff operates as a trickster alongside Hal, with Hal and in tension with Hal, is that he fundamentally questions the distinctions between the king and the king's people. Because that relationship is the thing that allows Henry to become king.
Well, then what about American literature, Amanda? Are there tricksters showing up on this side of the Atlantic?
I mean, I think that the most famous ones probably are Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn.
Yeah.
And Mark Twain. The thing is about The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is they were two books that are often kind of, or at least when we were young, were often presented together as kind of companion novels. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But the cool thing is, like, Tom Sawyer is really just much more of a playful children's novel, right? Tom's pranks are, they are light trickstery. He gets kids to paint the fence for him. He fakes his own death. Like, he's the order he's rebelling against is very low stakes. It's just mean aunties and kind of it's a comedy of sort of tickling the noses of 19th century propriety in the way that Mark Twain really liked to do, using this boy character,
like an early Little Rascal or something.
Exactly. And I think that created a tradition, that the Little Rascals are part of, and that is just throughout American history. Huckleberry Finn is a different book. It's using the same kind of premise and the same kind of character, but Huck's a little more of a raw and edgy character because he's not some middle-class kid being raised by quote-unquote good people, but by he's an abandoned half-orphan whose alcoholic father terrorizes him, right?
Right.
But most importantly, Huck's rebellion is against slavery, is against racism, is against a different kind of social order that's a lot more poignant and pointed and political. And I like these two together because it shows the breadth of what you can do with a trickster character. You can use them for Yeah, everything from light comedy to searing social commentary.
Yeah.
And Mark Twain really run the breadth of that with those two characters.
All right, Maeve, any last important comparisons from literature to Loki and or trickster gods?
Yeah, there's one more that I think is worth thinking about. It's also a story that I think we often don't think about as being a trickster story, but has trickster elements in it that share some proximity to what I think we might see in Loki, and that's Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim, which is a story about an orphan, a little boy named Kim, who is living in India because his father was a soldier for the British. He was Irish, though. And so Kim's this kind of really interesting orphan figure who starts out as a trickster, right? Just a kind of straight up, aimless little boy orphan roaming around India and, carrying out pranks against people.
Okay.
But he's actually really talented. He sort of flies under the radar. So he ends up being recruited by the British government as a spy. And so one of the things that I think is worth thinking about between these two figures is that Loki is a trickster who's also, in at least what's being suggested by the previews, is also being recruited by institutional power.
Okay.
And so I think it will be worth thinking about what happens when tricksters, who are these upenders of convention, what happens when their power gets adopted or appropriated by the powerful, whether or not that group of powerful people is like doing something good or disruptive or whatever. But what happens when we take a trickster, and if we're not quite reforming them, although we kind of are with Loki, if we're not quite reforming them, what happens when institutional power or state power, as in the case of Kim, recruits that trickster energy?
That's fascinating. So basically, the British government is the time variance authority when it comes to Kim being recruited and turned into an instrument to be used to do whatever it is they want to do. People can jump ahead a few seconds if they don't want to hear the answer to the question I'm about to ask, which is, what happens to Kim? I'm curious, and do you think that sort of would say anything about where they're going to take Loki? And we're going to talk more about that in a second, but I'm just kind of curious what happens to that character.
Well, the situation with Kim is tricky because Rudyard Kipling, who was a real critic of empire, turns Kim into a character who kind of finds himself through being incorporated into power. And it's tricky in a couple of different ways. And part of it has to do with what Rudyard Kipling is criticizing when it comes to empire. He's not just criticizing the imperial project. He's criticizing the way that imperial power hides hierarchies of class in Britain. So Kim is Irish, right? So he's in what we would call in academia internally colonized, right? Kim is an Irish little boy who in Britain itself would have no power, but being sent off to the colonies, he's given this kind of, it's not fake power, it's real power over his, over the Indian subjects of the empire. But it's a little bit of a fallacy in terms of the way that he's able to kind of climb a social ladder and climb out of marginalization.
Yeah, so he winds up in sort of like a middleman kind of position, it sounds like you're saying. Like there's people above him, which are the true sort of English or whatever, the leaders of all of this stuff. They're the Indian subjects of the empire below, and he's sort of operating in this little space in between. I would be interested to see if that reflects on where Loki finds himself. Because on one hand, he's a god and some immortal being with a ton of power. We know he's very magical and all sorts of other fun things about him. But at the same time, he's dealing with a different set of immortal beings here who presumably have some control over time itself. And that feels like, maybe it might be a little more strength than even he has at his fingertips.
Yeah, and maybe an opportunity to really think about how we distribute power in the world, particularly when we think about power as having sort of technological dimensions. Like magic is a kind of technology, time travel is a kind of technology. How do those things how do those sort of discoveries and inventions and new practices themselves have trickster potential to kind of unseat the way we understand how power operates in the world and how it gets distributed?
And, the British government certainly thought they were the great civilizers of the world, or the East India Company
Yes,
did.
they did.
And maybe the Time Variance Authority will be much the same way, that they have this hubris that suggests that, hey, we know best for everybody and how things should be, and we fix it all up, which may or may not be any more true than it is for the British government. I don't know. That'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, like when, the British government saying, but we brought you the railways. It's like, that and slavery. Thanks.
Yeah, it all comes out in the wash, right? No, it does not. Nope. So maybe there'll be something to say here about colonization through time as opposed to space, which is what we're used to thinking of it as. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. But I want to put you guys on the spot now. If you have to pick one, Amanda, what's your favorite single Trickster character ever?
Divine.
Yes.
Divine.
In all movies, but especially, obviously, in the infamous Pink Flamingo.
Oh, fantastic.
So tell people about Divine first. Set the table a little. Tell us a little bit about Divine.
So Divine was a drag queen from the 60s and 70s, I guess through the 90s when she died. And basically, she herself was kind of a trickster character. First of all, drag queens are inherently somewhat trickstery kind of characters. Like they exist purely to upend our ideas of gender and how it's performed, right? But then Divine was on top of that a very punk rock kind of version of drag queen. Up until Divine, most drag queens were what they call female impersonators. They either did imitations of celebrity women a lot of the time, and that was how they made their money, or they competed in pageants, and so often along pretty heteronormative beauty standards, surprisingly. Divine said, fuck all of that. She tried to look ugly. She tried to look weird. She tried to be shocking. She did humor that was very sexual, very transgressive. She didn't want to look pretty at all. So she wanted to look glamorous, but ugly. And she ate dog shit.
That is a fact.
Ew.
Pink flamingos. I at least put it in her mouth long enough to smile at the camera and then spat it out. Anyway. But and the whole point of the movie Pink Flamingos, which is a tough movie, I think, for a lot of people to watch, but I adore. Yeah. The plot of the movie is that Divine and her family are the trashiest people on earth, and they get into a trash contest with these other people, this other family that want to be the trashiest people on earth, but they could never really compete because they're just evil, right? Okay. They sell heroin to school children and kidnap people and hold them in the basement, whereas Divine's family is gloriously life-affirmingly trashy.
Love it.
They just live trash. They're chaos. They're not evil. And there's actually something kind of profound in that movie about the difference between a villain and a trickster, right? Okay. Which is Divine's character is a trickster. They're just no regard for social norms at all, finds them repulsive, but not a hateful or hurtful person unless you cross her, and then she'll murder you.
So grotesque rather than cruel, for example.
Not cruel at all.
Yeah.
It's a wild movie. Again, not for the faint-hearted. There's a lot of other ways to engage Divine without seeing that movie. Her music, some of her art with the Cockettes in San Francisco, some of the other John Waters movies. But by far, I think my favorite of all time, Trickster characters.
I love what you're saying because it also reminds me then that camp is a trickster practice.
Oh, interesting.
Right? So if we think of camp as this set of practices that are often, but not always, but often, about playing with gender conventions and gender expectations, that Divine is ripping those apart and then recomposing them according to tricksterdom or tricksterness. And that's a really, because I think sometimes we think about camp as flamboyance, but here it's about not just something more political, because flamboyance is political, but something that toys at the edges of something like the grotesque or the carnivalesque, right? These things that are sort of, again, about sort of tearing things apart and putting them back together in ways that aren't meant to be beautiful or pretty and according to some like really outdated aesthetic convention or staid aesthetic convention. Like Marcel Duchamp, right? Like toilet in a museum, right?
It's very, Dada's very camp. And like, I would say a lot of camp is also just appreciating anybody or anything in the world, like kind of a fun, semi-ironic appreciation for anything in the world that is messy.
Yeah.
Like, like hot messes are camp, right? Like there's that piece of like wanting to, like Real Housewives is a campy show because it's all of these women trying and failing to adhere to conventional femininity because their very ambition to be it cuts against the grain of what we consider traditional femininity, and so it's inherently camp because it's just you can't help but relish the chaos of it.
Yeah, it's great too because it's also about valorization. So like a reality TV show that includes either actors that haven't been able to sort of make it big or are just like the housewives of X, Y, or Z, right? Are not people that we would make a television show about, but then we do, and so we revalorize right these figures that are really kind
also
of
mocking
against
them.
Yeah, well, also mocking them, and of course that camp does that too. Camp is. I think there's a difference between a figure like Divine that uses camp to their own advantage or uses camp to self-express.
There's created camp and then there's camp that just exists in the wild, and both are very
accidental
valid.
Or something, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But a lot of people would argue that accidental camp is the purest form of camp.
Yeah, but also finding ways to find it valuable and beautiful, that there's beauty in it, even when we wouldn't normally assign beauty to it.
Well then, Maeve, what about you? I'm putting you on the spot now. What's your favorite single Trickster character ever?
So my absolute favorite in this sort of canon of twisted fairy tales is a revision of Red Riding Hood by Henri Gauthier-Villars, who we don't read his fiction any longer. He was a French writer, French novelist. His wife was Colette, or was known as Colette. She was nominated for a Nobel Prize. There was a movie made about her, I think last year or the year before. Anyway, so he has this rewriting of a series of fairy tales, and each one is one paragraph long.
Huh.
So they're super short. And the fairy tale is told from the wolf's perspective. Because he's pissed off because Red Riding Hood has tricked him into murdering her grandmother because her grandmother treats her badly. And then while he is strangling her grandmother, she calls the police on him, and he ends up having to do 20 years of hard labor. She convinces the police that he's an anarchist. I mean, like, it's just bizarre. Wow. It's just like a bizarre short story about a trickster who we don't even get to hear from, really. I mean, he quotes her in convincing him that his grandmother, her grandmother, needs to die. And then basically what happens, according to him, is that, he does 20 years of hard labor, and Red Riding Hood goes off and lives on the inheritance from her grandmother.
That does sound like some Loki shit. Like, that sounds like Loki pretending to be Red Riding Hood and then causing all this chaos. That actually feels super on point for Loki energy. It's fun.
It's a fun little morsel in which, Red Riding Hood is just, a badass, sort of getting what she needs and being a little evil, right? Like, this is kind of the opposite of Divine, right? Like, Divine is not evil. Like, this is legit evil.
Yeah, definitely evil, right? Our grandmother's dead. That's, that's murder.
Divine's a little evil. I mean, she murders her enemies.
Right. That's chaotic neutral to your point earlier, though, right? I mean, chaotic neutral is you're willing to be bad, you're willing to be evil, you're willing to be good, you're willing to be evil.
Sometimes you got to be bad.
Maybe Red Riding Hood founded a charity after she murdered her grandmother to offset the damage. Who can say? We don't get that far, I guess.
Yeah. Doubt it.
All these characters from literature are fascinating to me. But Loki cannot be the only modern character version of this trickster concept that we can get. Maeve, are there any popular characters in more modern stories that play the trickster role? Someone people maybe even might not think of it as a trickster, but they should, or is obviously a trickster. Where can we look in more modern works to find a trickster?
So, I think a lot of people think that the Joker is a trickster. And I would actually argue that the Joker is not a trickster.
It's just like a sadist.
He's evil. Yeah, he's a sadist. He also has more of a plan than tricksters often have, right? Tricksters are also pretty spontaneous. They're reactive. So I would argue that Harley Quinn is a trickster. And I think that may be something that, people find unsurprising. But Harley Quinn, especially in the most recent movie, which I enjoyed enormously, is a trickster because not only is she spontaneous, joyous, rebellious, she also does it with purpose. And tricksters aren't, as we've been saying, they're not just randomly chaotic. There's often something driving their chaos agency towards some kind of change. And especially in the most recent film and in other incarnations of Harley Quinn in the comics, she is a figure that is trying to remake a world around her that grants her a more meaningful place.
Yeah, and the Joker is much more of just a villain.
Yeah, he's just a straight up bad guy.
Well, I certainly dig the Harley Quinn answer. Amanda, do you have anyone on your list from modern works and stories?
I mean, I think that the one we haven't talked about that really should be obvious so far, that really should be obvious, is Bugs Bunny, man. What? He's the
Looney Tunes, baby.
He might be the most classic trickster character of the 20th century. The whole point of every Bugs cartoon is that there's some stiff-neck motherfucker that Bugs just blows through their life and ruins it, but they have it coming because they're just too rigid or want to shoot guns like Yosemite Sam or some other person who has too big an ego and needs to be taken down a few notches by Bugs Bunny. So I think if you were to think of even just one of the most classic, most iconic trickster characters, it's Bugs.
Yeah. I mean, in that pantheon is Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, right?
Yeah.
These sort of figures that are just real challengers and pranksters. I mean, in some ways, Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner are more prankster than trickster. But
I guess I think of Roadrunner as a great answer to this. He's also unintelligible, which I actually think factors into the trickster thing, which is to say, just this pure agent of chaos who is sort of unknowable to us. Or we can't really even access what is the internal life of the Roadrunner. He's just, he's just constantly destroying this coyote. And maybe not by choice, but also maybe by choice. I don't know. It's tough to say.
He goes back and forth. You never know with him. Sometimes it's seems like he's not doing it on purpose. Sometimes he winks at the camera a little. Indeed.
Yeah, as Coyote falls off a cliff and then the neck goes and it's, Interesting. Okay, Looney Tunes. All right, I'm buying it. What else?
Well, I mean, Ali G, right? I mean, wow. Sacha Baron Cohen, his pantheon of characters are all trickster characters. Ali G, saying to Boutros Ghali, Boutros Ghali. I mean, it's not only rude, it's also totally disruptive of the idea that this is a person who, deserves a sort of a measure of respect. There's sometimes though where Sacha Baron Cohen's characters are just mean. But maybe there's a little cruel, going back to your point about Divine, right? There's a little bit of cruelty wrapped up in the trickster character, and sometimes it's necessary.
But yeah, Borat taking Rudy Giuliani down on camera certainly seems to fit the narrative.
Not sad about that.
I thought about Breaking Bad in that pantheon or that particular universe because so much of what makes tricksters interesting is watching them come up with elaborate schemes and then pulling them off, right? Yeah. But Walter White is not a trickster because he's too malevolent to be one. But Saul Goodman I think Saul Goodman is very much a trickster character. And in Better Call Saul, I think we get even more of that. We find out, he's got the Slip and Jimmy past, but more importantly, like that whole show is about how he continues to feel the draw of respectability, and yet deep down inside he just can't. He just can't. Like the chaos calls to him. The need to go to the bar with Kim and run a grift on somebody. He just can't. And you never feel like he's doing it for malevolent reasons, just for the sheer joy of pulling one over on people.
It's funny, too, because Saul is a character who he comes off as a little bumbling sometimes, but he's super fucking smart. And that goes back to something we were saying about tricksters, is that they're intelligent and cunning, but they don't need to be graceful.
Yeah.
Right?
And in fact, grace is like...
They can be graceless.
Grace is a quality of the ordered world in a lot of ways. So they should be ugly like divine. Or at least goofy like bugs. Yeah, goofy, a little bit graceless. I feel like there's another way of thinking about that sort of, but there are graceful trickster figures, right? Well, Loki to an extent, yeah.
And Harley Quinn to some extent.
Although he is also a little bumbling in the films.
Well, and Harley Quinn's like a messy drunk. Like there's always that piece there.
Yeah, exactly.
One that really hopped to mind that's a little bit more obscure, but I think the audience for this show will immediately latch on to, especially if they like some of the pre-Avengers Joss Whedon work, is Saffron, which is Christina Hendricks' character in Firefly. She's presented as iconic in a trickster way. She kind of drifts in and out of Mal's life, and every single time somehow manages to trick that mofo into believing that she's good or she's helpful or that she's going to somehow be useful to him. And in the end, leaves him holding the bag while she gets off into the middle of the night. And like a classic trickster, right? She's never malevolent. She's not a villain, which is why he keeps falling for her over and over again. But she's not good either. She's just selfish and she's in it for herself. But because of that, she always kind of gets away with it, which is why I think tricksters make such fun villains in movies, because you don't want to kill them off or put them in jail like you would a classic villain. You can always sort of bring them back for another scheme.
And you admire their hustle, right? There's something really admirable about the hustle that they are able to pull off with the protagonist or with any other character that also seems like you could never pull the wool over their eyes.
Yeah, like the fun is watching them be really smart in a way that is not only not there for the audience, like you as the audience member don't imagine you could ever pull off a scheme like that, but neither can most of the characters on the show, as smart as they are. Yeah, exactly. So I got one more that I think might come out of left field a little bit here. And that is the duo of Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion in WAP. So, we think of this song, the conventional reading of this song is it's two women really owning their sexuality and owning their eroticism. And it is a fucking powerful song. And it might as well be this summer's anthem as much as it was last summer's anthem, and maybe just into eternity, right? We're just going to love this song forever. But that song also is super critical of the norms and conventions of macho sexuality that objectify women and their sexuality, instrumentalizing it, right? So these two women, if we look at the music video and we think about the way that song kind of unfolds, right? With the, I don't cook or clean, but I'm here to sort of enjoy my erotic desires. There's a kind of reappropriation of women's sexuality in a way that upends by shocking us, right? By saying, I'm going to be all the things that you say I am to you, macho, dude culture, right?
And then I'm going to reappropriate it for my own pleasure. And I'm going to then take that to the next level and objectify the sort of masculine sexual desire that you might have for me. I objectify and instrumentalize that. And there's something that is really playful about the way that song toys with our expectations about what women are supposed to say about their bodies in sex and tricks us into buying it, fully buying it. And of course, none of us want to not sing that song. And yet if we do, there is something kind of subversive about our appropriation of their reappropriation. And that's another thing that we haven't talked about with respect to Tricksters. And that is that it's also about appropriation and reappropriation, taking things that have otherwise been marginalized and turning them into the center of power.
Yeah, and that song does it in like a very blunt way, which is very common with Tricksters, which is just to take something it's messiness, it's wet ass pussy, it's literally
get a mop.
it's wallowing in like bodily fluids in a way that I think is shocking to the system, because women are barely allowed to acknowledge those bodily fluids, and yet it's just reveling in them.
Saul Goodman, Harley Quinn, Ali G, even Saffron turns out to be pretty cool. Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion are definitely people we all root for. So again, I feel like we're turning to these tricksters that are mostly heroic. But I think about Loki in Avengers especially, and he was just a straight up villain conquering the world. Why are so few of these trickster characters connected to that level of behavior, the way Loki is in Avengers, I guess?
I mean, I personally, I know a lot of people love Avengers, and there's a lot to love about that movie. But what I would say is I find that Loki in that movie insanely frustrating.
Okay.
Because we know that Joss Whedon understands how trickster characters are supposed to work, because he wrote Saffron in Firefly, and he had similar characters on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, just chaos agents who just exist to upend social order. But Loki is a fascist in Avengers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And a fascist is the exact opposite of a trickster.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, kneel before me and he's literally compared to a Nazi, and I'm like, Nazis are villains, but they are definitely lawful.
Not tricksters.
Yeah, they're lawful evil.
Yeah,
that's
right.
just the inherent nature of lawful evil. They are not tricksters. Loki is a trickster in Ragnarok. Loki is a trickster in Thor. He plays that role in many ways throughout the MCU, but in Avengers, that character has failed in a lot of ways. He's actually more like a Cardassian on Deep Space Nine, which is to say, he's a space fascist. He's witty, he's well-dressed, but he's a space fascist. And, they failed that character miserably in that movie, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I do think there's a chance that since the Loki who escapes at the end of Endgame is the one who just completed his little fascist adventure in New York City, I think there's a good chance that Loki is the bad guy. I don't think that we have to assume that Loki is the one who then goes off and immediately becomes the hero. We don't know which timeline and what time they pull the Loki that we're going to root for from, and we'll find out soon enough here. But I think there's a chance that you're making so much sense, both of you, about how we kind of need to rethink this Loki. I wonder if the meta way to do that is to make that Loki the bad Loki that this Loki has to chase down and deal with. I don't know, something that could make sense of that, because I actually really buy the argument that Avengers Loki sits outside of the trickster character. That's a really, really cool idea, even if it makes me a little more frustrated with that movie.
Yeah.
So I have one more question for you both, and that is about this idea that we're compelled by these characters. This is what we've been talking about all episode. People enjoy rooting for Loki, even back in that first Thor movie where he just looks like this mousy weirdo. Why are we on this podcast so compelled by this type of character?
I think there's a serious answer to that question, and it has to do with our obsession with trickster characters. We've talked about trickster characters so far from antiquity to the present, right up to the present, right? And philosophy has tackled a question that is related to this. And that is starting with probably Hobbes, but, going forward to John Stuart Mill, more recently, Fukuyama. There is an understanding in political philosophy and in philosophy, or a way of understanding human beings that says that human beings kind of innately understand that other humans are equal to them in really fundamental ways, right? It's one of the reasons why we strive for more equal systems in the world. It's why human rights has been perennially and perpetually and repeatedly a problem for human beings. So human beings have a kind of innate sense of equality. Human civilization, paradoxically, does not perfectly or consistently foster that equality. And so we live in a state of tension, maybe even contradiction sometimes, between our innate desire and drive to just look at a human being and say, oh yes, another human, equal to me in fundamental ways, even if the world around us doesn't foster the equality between us, right? So the thing about tricksters is that they are corrective measures against inequality or hierarchies. They're always interested in power and how power gets distributed unevenly in the world. So tricksters, I think, remain a fascination for us because, and repeatedly, because we've never resolved this problem, that humans recognize the innate equality of other human beings while living in worlds that seem to press against the maintenance of meaningfully equal systems of power.
To add to that, I would say that one of the things that is true about life is we impose order on our environment and on our lives because we must, right? But, I'm sitting here in the basement of our house and I have my giant record collection and I have all my records classified by genre because I need to know where they are when I'm playing them. So a very good example. However, on the other hand, we all know that on some level that those orders and those definitions and those categories that we impose on the world are fuzzy at best. Yeah. Sometimes lies. The polite academic term is social construction. It doesn't mean it's not true. Obviously. No. That's why we use a term like social construction. When somebody says something like gender is a social construction, we're not saying male and female aren't real. They're obviously real. What we're saying is those are also invented categories that because they're invented, they are not necessarily perfect reflections of the world. There are a lot of people that fall outside of our social distinctions about what constitutes male or female.
And many of those social distinctions are oppressive and restrictive and exclusive because we create hierarchies out of them, right? Yeah. It's not just that these things, when we say, male and female, we're not just drawing neutral distinctions between kinds of people. We are drawing hierarchical distinctions that are rooted in histories of hierarchy and practices of hierarchization and all of that. They're not neutral. Language isn't. Even when they impose order that we need, and we feel like we need, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in the same way that humans are innately capable of recognizing the equality of other human beings, the other thing that is innately human is our desire to categorize and analytically understand the world around us in terms of categories that make sense of the universe, allow us to make knowledge out of the universe.
But tricksters exist to speak a truth that's sort of deeper that we all know on some level is there, which is that these categories are imperfect at best, and that they are not a perfect description of the world, and that sometimes those imperfections can be oppressive or terrible or cause terrible power differentials. The Loki of mythology changes gender.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I was curious to know if that's going to come up here.
It does in the comics. There are definitely female versions of Loki in the comics, so I won't be surprised at all if we get that. There are a few actors that have been cast that we don't know the roles for, so possible female Lokis are in play.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Like, it's a classic thing that a trickster does, is to remind us that these categories, things like male and female, and I only just picked that because that was just the one that is on the minds of a lot of people these days in our nation.
For good reason.
Yeah, for good reason. But it's the fact that Loki can change genders, that a lot of people can change genders, or that gender isn't as black and white as we want to think it is a truth that Loki reminds us of, and that a lot of like trickster characters can. There's other social orders that they sort of poke holes through, that it ends up being a reminder that our rules and regulations are invented and they can be rewritten. You know, when we were writing this I was thinking a lot about Saturnalia, which was kind of the holiday prior to Christmas and has sort of been reinvented into Halloween and Carnival and April Fools and other things like that. But kind of in its original form, it was a time when the lower classes would go to the houses of the upper classes and basically just overrun their houses and make them feed them and sing songs with them. And the whole point of it was a reminder that this class system is a little bit of an artificial construct, that it's about luck of who you were born and not like some kind of natural law.
Well, this is all fascinating stuff. I have to say, one of my main takeaways from this is that Loki has really been miscast as a villain in a lot of ways. I'm not a huge fan of the governmental system of Asgard. Let's be honest, kings are bullshit. Loki being portrayed as someone who's power hungry and a climber and attempting to get people to kneel does feel wrong. The Loki who's here to just kick sand in the face of kings and make them rethink these things feels like a much more compelling character. I'll be interested to see how much of that we get. And you know, the Loki that we do like, that we enjoyed in stories like Ragnarok, I think made Thor a better person by pushing his boundaries a little bit, like you guys have talked about. Who knows just where this Loki will wind up? But thank you both so much. I have a ton more to think about as we head into this series.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking about all the things that come out of this show.
All right, Amanda, where can people find and follow you if they want to talk more about this series?
I'm on Twitter at Amanda Marcotte, just my name, my first name, my last name, one word. And you can go to salon.com and read me there as well.
And Maeve, what about you? Where can people find and follow you?
So folks can find me over at Twitter at Maeve Adams. You can also read my scholarly work. It's all uploaded at academia.edu.
All right, Audio Avengers, we have a ton more Loki to preview on Pondervision, where we'll get into the TVA, and on Charactercast, where we'll get into all the versions of Loki, including this new insight from Amanda about whether fascist Loki qualifies. So keep your ear out for those pods on Saturday and Monday. Then we will be here to break down the first episode of Loki on Thursday with more Storycast. It's a hot Marvel summer, y'all, and the Marvelous TV Club will help you build the Bifrost body of your dreams. And if you're enjoying our show, please leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in those search rankings. It would mean the world to us. If you want to talk more with me, join me on the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page or follow me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, F as in Frank, Aletti. All right, team, let's go listen to some Ramones records and see if Tom Hiddleston's voice shows up anywhere.